Alright everybody, I'm back once again after a little bit of a hiatus. I was working on some other stuff, but not too long ago I found this little beauty and picked it up at an antique store. I'd seen these Rocohs before. This is a Rocoh 500, which is a fixed lens rangefinder from Japan from sort of the late 50s, kind of my general style. And I'd seen them around before. I'd been kind of intrigued by the trigger advance type mechanism, and I ended up picking this one up at a okay price. Not exactly a steal, but it did seem to be in good condition. And I thought the price wasn't too bad, and I'd been interested in one, and I thought, why the heck not? I'll pick it up and give this a try. And I have to say, it's kind of an interesting camera. It has some really nice gimmicks and it has some interesting design features, but it does have some weird quirks, like a lot of the cameras I cover. So I was just going to kind of go over this and show you a few photos I've taken with it recently, and give you another brief overview of an interesting camera. So when you start off with this camera, I think the most interesting and most noteworthy thing is this sort of trigger advance, I guess. I mean, you have this part that's a trigger, but then the actual advance is really more just a bottom slung lever. And I think that's kind of interesting. It looks really unique, and I don't think there's too many that work quite like this. Most of them have a longer trigger that kind of pops out of the bottom, sort of like the Canon, I think it's some of the Canon 4 and 5 family, or maybe 5 and 6, and you have some add-on triggers for Leicas and things of that nature that you see around from time to time. It's an interesting feature, but at the end of the day, I don't know how useful it is. You would think it's faster, but you have to use a little bit of force to move it. It takes a little bit more force than a standard thumb advance, so it's not super fast in my mind. And of course, if you have it kind of stowed like that, you have to kind of whip out the trigger, then start advancing. So I don't know if it would really be much faster than a standard thumb advance, but it is kind of neat. One thing I noticed about this is you use your left hand to advance it, and you have these twin focus throws, one on each side. So in my opinion, it kind of feels like this camera was built with left-handed users in mind. It was still designed obviously to be ambidextrous, but it does seem like they took some extra care to try and make it a little bit more appealing for left-handed people. I can't confirm that since I'm not left-handed. I haven't really seen any literature that denotes that. But if you are left-handed and have one of these cameras, maybe you could leave your feedback and tell me if you think it's easier or harder to use or about the same. I would imagine it's probably about the same. And I do kind of like that. It is a little interesting. It's a slightly different user experience, but nothing too alien. One thing I'm not a big fan of is with these twin focus throws. Whenever I hold it, I'm usually focusing with the left hand, and the other knob over here, this little tab, kind of knocks against my fingers, and I don't really like that because I feel like I have to move my hand back, and I'm holding the camera in a really weird ginger, like, oh, it's going to slip out of my hands kind of way, and it's just a little too... it's just not a great design feature. I don't know why they did that. I think there's a good reason. They normally just have one focus throw tab, and why a lot of them are shorter and kind of have that indentation where you kind of put your finger in it. That's one thing Leica and Voigtlander do really well, is most of theirs are built in that manner. And a lot of them are actually removable too. So again, that's a nice feature. Whereas with these, they stick out and they're stuck on there. So I feel like they're going to get in your way a lot of times. That is one of the major disadvantages this camera has in my mind. It has a little film counter right there, pretty standard. You've got a flash. This is your film rewind right here. You hold that down, you pull out the little crank, and you start rewinding. It has a really nice crank. It just seems like it's very nice looking, very high quality. The viewfinder is, it's nice. It has a pretty high contrast rangefinder patch right in the middle. It has sort of highlighted frame lines that are parallax correcting. It seems like it's pretty darn accurate from what I've seen, and everything's very visible in there. It has very bright frame lines, and the rangefinder patch is pretty bright. Not the brightest I've seen, but not bad at all. It doesn't have a self-timer. Oh, it actually does have a self-timer, I forgot. So, getting to the controls, everything is right here on the lens, which is pretty standard with these sort of like Copal leaf shutter style cameras. And the self-timer is right here on this outermost rim. You have M, your kind of standard mode, I guess, X, which is flash sync, and then you have a V, which is a self-timer, which I think by default is set to about 9 or 10 seconds. I don't know why they put it there and labeled it like that. It was very confusing, and I imagine if you didn't play around with the camera, you'd never guess it was there. Even like you just saw, I just forgot about it a moment ago. It doesn't have a standard tab or anything like most cameras, so it's kind of a nice design in some ways in that it's streamlined, but it's easy to forget about it or just not know about it, and I feel like I feel like also just having that one speed is not really ideal. I feel like a lot of people are going to use self-timers, probably want a longer time or maybe a shorter time for doing sort of tripod mounted, night exposures or something. So it's there, but I feel like it could be better and more usable. Next, we get to the shutter speeds around here. Go from a bulb to 1/500th of a second, pretty standard speeds. It is sync locked with the aperture. I've never been a huge fan of this feature. I know back in the old days this was probably kind of useful, but I just don't really care for it that much. You have apertures ranging from f22 to f2.8, pretty standard, and then of course you have a little focusing scale there, which seems to be reasonably accurate. 45mm lens, f2.8, pretty standard for this camera. I know there's another version that has, I believe, I think it's an f1.9 lens, and I think that has some other designation. I know there's some Rocoh 500 Deluxes. I think there's a 519 has the faster aperture, and I think there's a 503 which has some more advanced features or something. I don't remember every one of them. You can easily look it up if you want, but I don't really get into every variation. I'm just trying to cover the cameras I actually have and have used. Another strange thing is, all right, so you have a double lock down here at the bottom for removing the film back, which seems nice. We've seen other cameras like that, the Nikon S for instance, but with this I feel like the little knobs just don't really lock into place that well, and I'm afraid you could kind of like potentially knock them off and your back might fall off with film in there. I don't know how likely that is, but it doesn't seem impossible, so I would probably try to be careful about that and use a case if you can get your hands on one. You've got a little thing here, the little ISO marker, which does go up to 400, which is kind of nice. A lot of those older and cheaper cameras only go to like 1 or 200, so that's just a nice little feature that I think modern users will appreciate. Interestingly, this has an EP marking, which I don't get really excited about that stuff. For those of you who don't know, that basically means it was sold at a military commissary somewhere overseas, or possibly at like a duty-free store at an airport. So you wouldn't have to pay taxes on this when you were traveling out of country, like out of Japan. I don't know exactly how that worked. This was a big thing back in like the 50s and 60s, I guess. You see that on a decent number of cameras. Some people really like it. To me, it's frankly not that interesting. I mean, it's kind of marginally interesting, but I don't see that adding to the value. It gives you a hint of where this camera came from or who might have bought it in the past, which is kind of nice. It gives the camera a little character, but again, I just don't really care that much. All in all, it's a pretty nice, pretty solid camera. I have to say the images are pretty nice. The lens was a lot sharper than I thought. I wasn't really able to get a dramatic depth of field out of it, which disappointed me a little bit, but I mean, it's an f2.8, 45mm. There's a lot of other lenses like this are better, but I will say the sharpness kind of surprised me. It had a very nice contrast in black and white. Frankly, I would say out of all the kind of fixed lens, budget-ish Japanese rangefinders I've used, this probably has the best lens out of all of them, which did kind of surprise me. It's a lot better than stuff I've used in the past. Like, it's definitely better than the Brumberger, which I have right over here. I reviewed a little while ago. Kind of a neat little camera, but it was a pretty cheap camera in its day. Fairly light build quality, missing some features, not the best lens, but something I kind of enjoy. Just an interesting little obscure camera. If you compare it to stuff like the Canonet and stuff in the past, I think this actually has a better lens than the Canonet. I know some people are going to want to lynch me for saying that. The Canonet, obviously, the one I reviewed had a faster lens, which maybe would kind of downgrade the quality to a certain extent. But I felt like with the Canonet, when you had it extended to infinite focus, it just never looked that good. Whereas I think this lens looks a lot better. I also noticed with the Canonet, it seemed to flare a fair amount, where I didn't really see any flares with this lens. Now, granted, I haven't shot a ton of rolls through this camera, but I would say that it's a close contender for a Canonet, especially if you're looking at one of the older ones or one of the cheaper ones. You might want to go with this camera, because I think you're going to get a very similar quality, possibly a little better, and it's probably going to be cheaper. These cameras they're a little rarer, but they're not quite as well known or respected, so a lot of times you can get them cheaper. I think the one last thing I'd have to go over is when I got it, at first it was working fine. Oops, I gotta relock it here, I guess. You do the single stroke and, advances the film, cocks the shutter, all that kind of stuff. Works perfectly. But after using it for a while, I'd have to advance it, and it wouldn't quite click, and I'd have to push it a little more to get it, the shutter to click into place. And I thought, boy, that doesn't seem great. And it started towards the end of the first roll I had in it. So when I opened it up, I was playing around with it, and you can kind of see the mechanisms in here of how everything works. You see this is the actual little piece that moves everything. I don't even know what you call it. And I saw this screw here moving around, so I tightened that up, and it seemed to realign everything. So that is something to be aware of. If it seems to have an issue where you have to swipe this trigger multiple times, you might want to tighten up this screw right here. And I think the main reason I found it is because it looked like somebody had kind of tightened it and used it before, and it was kind of scuffed up, and there were some clear signs of wear. So I figured the previous user probably had the same thing happen to him a couple of times and had to tighten it up. So I don't know if that's a common issue with the camera, or maybe this model is just heavily used and kind of worn. Could be a little bit of both. When you have older cameras like this, realistically, they're never going to be in perfect condition. You're always going to have some minor problems with them, and there's always going to be inconveniences and stuff. And it kind of sucks in some ways, but in other ways, I think that's kind of the charm of some of these cameras, is that they're not the easiest thing to use. You have to know a little bit about them. And if you're willing to work with them and give them a chance and kind of study them and practice with them, you can get really nice results, like better than you would think for a lot of these old cameras. Maybe not quite on par with some of the modern day super high-end lenses and super high megapixel sensors or super high ISO sensors, but then again, if you're shooting old vintage film cameras, you're probably not looking for that kind of look. You're probably looking for more like high contrast, black and white, self-developed with a lot of grain, or some sort of exotic colors with something like Portra, of course. Everybody loves Kodak Portra pushed to some extremity. You're using a really high-speed version of it. I'm not a big fan of the latter. I do like the former with the high contrast black and white with some grain, that kind of classic photography look. And I think a camera like this lends itself very well to that look. So, yeah, that's it. I've babbled on. You can take a look at some of the images I've taken with this camera. Nothing too remarkable. Like I said, I haven't had this camera for all that long. Haven't put a lot of film through it. Haven't even put color film through it, which is getting to be a trend with me. But then again, you look at the price of color film, and I don't think you can really blame me. But interesting little camera right here. Just something I thought I'd come back and get back in the swing of doing things. I have a couple other lenses and stuff I might review at some point. But I do have that project I've been working on. That'll be out at some point in the future. Actually, the last video I put up kind of goes along with that project. I didn't really mean to publish that video publicly. I just put it up late at night and wasn't paying attention. But I have been working on a photo project I'm hoping to actually do some stuff with. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully you enjoyed this. And yeah, maybe leave a comment. Tell me about some other interesting, obscure cameras you know about. I've covered a few. I know of a few and just haven't gotten my hands on them. But if you know of a kind of cheap, underappreciated camera out there, I'd be interested to have your feedback and advice, so maybe I can try to pick up one of those and test it and review it or overview it some point in the not too distant future. Well, thanks for watching, and keep an eye on the channel. I got a lot more coming.